Erev Tov L'Kulam. Hi, everybody. What a treat to see so many faces, first of all, and some very special faces. I mean, all of you, I'm sure, have very special faces, but what a treat. Worth it just to come on to see some of you for the first time in ages. A pity that we can't make this a bit more interactive, but this is the downside of the age of Zoom. We've now gone from seminars where I could not be certain to get 5 people in the room to a registration of over 300, and we're up to about nearly 150 now. The stragglers will certainly appear before too long. I will not tarry now too much with all kinds of banter because I've made myself crazy today trying to figure out how to squeeze in a brief history that will nevertheless be relatively comprehensive. So tarte de satre, as we say, 2 things that contradict each other. And let this be the first plug for a book by the name of The Kabbalistic Tree, a history that has recently been accepted by the Littman Library for publication, and hopefully the manuscript will be in their hands within weeks, and hopefully in yours, well, let's just say in a year or so. So this is a coming attraction for the book, but I can't promise that it will be completely intelligible. It might be more in the spirit of elementary school show and tell on steroids. So I'm going to share my screen. If I can figure out how to do that. I should after a semester of teaching online. Let's see, hope this works. So I have I put 3 prezis together for this, and I'm going to have to transition manually from one to the next. But basically we have I would like to divide my presentation tonight between the classical Spherotic tree, the classical Kabbalistic tree, and the Lurianic tree. And the first thing I really want to say is, well, what I mean when I say tree. So as something of an homage to our host at the National Library, everybody loves the Kabbalistic tree. If you enter the now doomed building, and if you can get an appointment in Corona times and walk up the stairs, or if you can get your good buddy Daniel Abrams to walk up the stairs and take a picture for you, this is what you see, the Ardougne windows. What is more representative of the historical experience of the Jewish people than the Kabbalistic tree? Probably just about anything, but the Kabbalistic tree is what you see when you walk up the stairs at the National Library. And if I could make this a virtual tour of that floor of the National Library, we would turn left facing the Gershom Scholem Library and see wallpaper ilanot, wallpaper Kabbalistic trees as we entered Scholem's library, and even more upon entering. So this is a Kabbalistic tree of the kind that we'll speak about this evening or this afternoon, depending upon where you're listening from. Although this is not the genre of Kabbalistic trees, but a schema. This is an arboreal diagram in a codex, in a manuscript in book form, whereas tonight what I want to emphasize is the tree as a genre, as an ilan, what Kabbalists called an ilan. So as much as I would love to spend the next hour talking about volvels that you see here, have to be another time. We're going to have a lot of things that we'll have to talk about on another occasion. The other thing I wanted to say right off the bat was I'm not going to get involved in all kinds of speculations about the ancient and perennial Kabbalistic tree. I leave that to experts in perennialism. Unfortunately, to my mind, one of the articles that people know best about the history of the Kabbalistic tree is not a historical article at all, but it's the article written by Simo Parpola, who's an Assyriologist, and apparently a serious one, but apparently had some, ergot infected rye, and wrote this article on the Assyrian tree of life and the Kabbalistic tree of life. And this is simply on the screen now to say, this is not what I'm going to talk about. Lahavdil, I want to say a word just about the fact that a book was published about 15 years ago by Giulio Buzzi, my friend, who's at the Freie Universität in Berlin, which was the first work of its kind on what he called visual Kabbalah. And this is a very fascinating survey of the importance of visual materials in the history of Kabbalah that nobody paid attention to for over a century of scholarship. So within his very broad treatment of visual Kabbalah, he also takes a look at a number of ilanot, these Kabbalistic trees, as a genre that we'll be focusing on this evening, but without having done a really systematic research on this genre. So it's a fantastic starting place, but what I'll focus on this evening and what I focus on in my research is primarily diagrammatic parchment scrolls or rolls or rotuli, as the codicologists like to call them. This is a Kabbalistic tree. No, it's not actually. It's a genealogical tree, but it's on your screen simply to make the point that you can't tell simply by looking at a diagram what it's trying to communicate. You need to read the texts around it. You need to understand what the schema is attempting to communicate, because an arboreal diagram can communicate many things, as can concentric circles, the other most common schema used by Kabbalists. And as opposed to that Assyriologist whom I mentioned a moment ago, I don't think that Kabbalistic diagrams go back to ancient Assyria. What I do think is that the Kabbalistic diagrams that we see most used by Kabbalists throughout the Middle Ages and the early modern period came from medieval scientific literature, where in natural philosophy and in astronomy, the arboreal schema and the concentric circle schema were absolutely central for organizing and presenting information and structures, such as the structure of the cosmos itself. What you're seeing here on the screen are two examples of arboreal schemas called Porphyrian trees, which were used beginning in the Middle Ages in commentaries, Boethius's commentaries on Aristotle's categories, to create a drill down, kind of a drill down presentation of reality from the most general to the most specific. This was a very prestigious diagram in natural philosophy in the Middle Ages, and Kabbalists thought of themselves in the Middle Ages and in the early modern period as scientists. So it was not at all strange from their point of view to appropriate the most central diagrams of the scientific literature of their day, just as today's Kabbalists are playing around with 3D imaging on the internet or whatever it is. Maybe I shouldn't go there, but in the 14th century, we start seeing Kabbalists creating various layouts, arrays of the Spherote. The Spherote are the kind of the defining feature of Kabbalah as an esoteric system. These are reminiscent of Aristotle's categories. These are the categories or the hypostatic essences or qualities of the divine. And the Kabbalists wanted to know how they were arranged and how they were arranged in reality, what was their true structure. So there were two competing structures for these primary qualities of the cosmos. One was the concentric circles, and the other was what would become increasingly regarded as an arboreal figure. In the manuscript that you're seeing here, a 16th century copy of a 14th century work, you don't really sense that it's a tree so much, but it will become increasingly tree-like. This is a diagram of the Spherote that's in Gikatila's Gates of Light, Sha'arei Ora. It's starting to look maybe a bit more tree-like, although Gikatila had in mind more of a human form, as he explained around this diagram of the Spherote. If we jump to the 16th century and see in this manuscript the beginning of the discussion by Rabbi Moses Cordovero, the leading figure among the Kabbalists of Tzfat in the 16th century until his death, which almost coincided with Isaac Luria's arrival in 1570. He writes in this chapter 6, or 6th gate of his magnum opus, the orchard of pomegranates, Pardes Rimonim, that in this part of his work, he's going to deal with the structure of the Spherote. And one of the interesting things that he says here at the very beginning is, with regard to the B'inyan Surata Spherote, with regard to the form of the Spherote, by which I mean Seder Amidatan, the order of their standing, a terminology that is found in medieval astronomical literatures with regard to the constellations of the stars. Rabu bo hadeot. There are many opinions about how the Spherote are arrayed, what the actual constellation of the Spherote is. V'tziru lahem hamekubalim tzurot. And the Kabbalists have drawn for themselves forms, biyiriot gedolot, on large parchment sheets, biyiriot gedolot, v'karaum ilan. These they call an ilan, a tree. So now I got to the beginning of my lecture. These are the trees that I'm talking about. These parchment sheets used by Kabbalists, Cordovero's writing in the 16th century, basically giving us a kind of definition of the genre. Guillaume Postel also provided a similar, or at least also wrote in such a way as to indicate that he too regarded Ilanot by that very name as a genre in the 16th century. And these are something separate from Kabbalistic diagrams that you find in books. We're not only speaking about an arboreal figure, a schema, we're speaking about a genre. And so what I'd like to devote tonight's talk to is the nature of that genre. What do we find in these ilanot, in the classical period of the Kabbalah and in the Lurianic period of Kabbalah. So that's Cordevero's definition of the genre. I just will show you now a few of the oldest surviving ilanot. If we use Cordevero's definition of the genre as our guide, parchment sheets upon which a diagram of the spherotic array has been inscribed. And we can see already that these take a clearly arboreal tact. And this is a tree diagram that has 10 medallions that are sizable enough for inscriptions. And in and around the diagram, we have quite a few texts that are inscribed. This particular Ilan is in a library in the Italian city of Brescia. And I'd like to thank my cousin Eveline Chajes for having brought it to my attention while she was doing research in Brescia. Okay, about everything that I'm showing you tonight, we could spend more time on. So I'm gonna try not to say that too many times, but let's have a look at some of its peers, and then we'll have a better sense of what this kind of Ilan does. So this is in Brescia, perhaps from, it could be as early as the early 15th century. We know there were Ilanot similar to this already in the late 14th century. This is its first cousin, who lives in the Vatican library, Vatican 530. It looks a little bit different. The schema has been changed ever so slightly. One interesting thing about this 530 is that its verso, its backside also has some inscriptions. And you can see, actually, let me go back for a moment. You can see that rather than being rolled up, as we might expect a scroll to be, this has been folded, and it's been folded like you would fold a letter. And in fact, in that period when people sent letters, they would write them on parchment and then fold them and add the address on the part that showed after it had been folded. So you can see it's inscribed as some of us are old enough to remember those airmail letters that you folded up and inscribed. But this says, "Ze hatziur shel eser sfirot shebehen nivra ha'olam shekol haragil ubaki behen muftach lo shu ben chayei ha'olam haba. Ve'ani ve'eliyahu hanavi ve'Rabbi Akiva arevim v'chulei." This is the picture of the 10 Spherote by which the world was created. Everyone who is accustomed and accomplished in these Spherote is assured that he will be given a share in the world to come. And Rabbi Akiva is behind me on this one. And here we have a kind of colophon as well, which gives us the date and saying, Nichtav ze ha'ilan lebachur. All I really want to show from this is this 15th century colophon, where the scribe has said, this Ilan was written for this young man. Again, using this term Ilan, this is a tree, it's a parchment upon which the array of the Spherote has been inscribed. What else is going on there? So now just a moment on the texts that you've seen whizzing by on your screen. Going back to Brescia, you can see in the corner, rather close to the Spherote of Keter, crown, corona in Latin, Chokhmah, wisdom. Here you have a section that says Sphirat Chokhmah hi hamachshava. The Sphira of wisdom is thought, and a discussion of that, the nature of the Sphira of Chokhmah. Also, you have a discussion of the Sphira of Keter. So really the main thing to understand about the classical Ilan is that it's using the luxury of space on this parchment to embed in a framework established by that diagram knowledge about the spherotic system. So people who are familiar with the mnemonic arts, having read Francis Yates or Mary Carruthers or Lina Bolzoni, among others, but those are the giants, can appreciate the significance of inscribing knowledge in appropriate locations. So I want to understand the Sphira of Chokhmah, put the information about Chokhmah in the medallion of Chokhmah or adjacent to the medallion of Chokhmah. And this is what we find in these Ilanot. It turns out that this same text can be found on the Vatican manuscript as well. It's quite possible that it was written by Yosef Gicatilla, the author of The Gates of Light, or someone in his school, but it is one of the, it's a work in the genre of known as Perushei Eser Sphirot, commentaries on the 10 Sphirot, which are basically introductions to the 10 Sphirot. So you can see Sod HaKeter and Sfirat HaChokhmah, Tchilat HaMachshava, and so on. So this introduction to the Sphirot was part of the parchment. One of the chicken and egg problems of classical Ilanot is, did Kabbalists take commentaries on the Sphirot and then cut and paste the sections on each of the Sphirot onto their into their appropriate locations on the parchment, or are some of our commentaries on the Sphirot originally built into Ilanot, and for convenience sake were only thereafter removed or excised from those parchments, which were a bit unwieldy, I guess, even if you could fold them. Easier to write it down on a couple of pages or include it in your codex miscellany. But of course, something is lost in that movement from one medium to another. This is another Vatican manuscript, just to show you that in this case, I think it's likely that the composition that's on the parchment was originally part of the parchment, that it was written, that the parchment Ilan was created as an iconotext that integrated its diagrammatic and textual content. But it wasn't convenient for everybody, so we find codices, manuscripts that are in book form rather than as scrolls, in which the material is presented like we would expect from a book, one sphira after another in a linear fashion. One of the tip-offs, to my mind, that the Ilan came first is that in many cases, we see a kind of vestigial trace of the Ilan in the codex. In this case, you can see that for the Sphira of Chokhmah, the scribe has included the medallion of Chokhmah in the representation of its content in the codex. Another beautiful classical Ilan was crafted in 1533 by two Kabbalists who were in Venice, Menachem Khalfan and Avraham Tzorfati. Again, I promised I wouldn't say it too many times. There's so many stories. Each one of these artifacts has stories to tell that are to some of us more interesting than the Kabbalistic content, I'll admit. These two Kabbalists in 1533, one of them was the host, the younger man, Khalfan, was hosting the venerable Kabbalist Avram Tzorfati, and in their testimonials that each of them inscribed on the verso, the backside of the parchment, they described how they decided to do this project while they were together at the time. And Tzorfati says, he was such a good host. He put out clean bed sheets for me and gave me a table with a candle. And what could I give this guy? I mean, what do you give to the Kabbalist who has everything? He says, I said to him, let's make an Ilan, and we'll gather together fantastic material from all of the greatest Kabbalistic books that are on a bookshelf of a Kabbalist in Venice in 1533. And we have here about a 15,000 word anthology of Italian, it's not all Italian Kabbalah, but the Kabbalah that was on his bookshelf, let's say, augmented by some very interesting illuminations. Some of them are simply typical of Ilanot, even in their much more austere codex forms. For example, the cherubs, the shewbread table, the altar, and the candelabrum, the menorah from the temple, those are typical. Much less typical and a unicum is the fact that he had a scene from the Garden of Eden added to the Ilan, showing Adam and Eve and Satan riding Lilith. That's quite unusual. Something I'd like to point out here, besides the fact that you can see very extensive passages have been copied out of works to make this an anthological parchment in the truest sense, but the medallions of the Spherote themselves are full of the appellations of the Spherote. Everybody who studied a little Kabbalah knows that the Spherote have many names. And one of the reasons, well, I don't know if it's a reason they have many names, but when you know all of the associations for each of the Spherote, you have a kind of, you have the code that enables you to decipher reality in all of its dimensions, whether it's biblical characters, who do they correspond to? Whether it's the limbs of the body, what do they correspond to? The days of the week. So many aspects of creation are divided up and assigned their places in the spherotic structure. And so you see that a central role for the medallions in the classical Ilan is a place to aggregate these associations. Here's a Pachad or Gvura, Din, and you see Gibor, Esh Shchora, Yira'ah, Argaman, and so forth. This is a typical function of the classical Ilan. And once again, we look around and we can find the texts that were used by Khalfan and Tzorfati to fashion this Ilan. Unlike the two we've seen just moments ago, which I think were built as a, let's say, whole cloth with text and image in mind from the beginning, we know by their own testimonies that this was meant to be an anthology of materials. And so you see, Im tish'al ata ha'me'ayen, if you ask, if you who are contemplating this Ilan ask such a question? Well, if we go to the British Library, we can find what seems to be the source for this, which again shows some indication that it was related to an Ilan, but in this case, it could be that Khalfan was building on an earlier Ilan, which had the appellations of the Spherote and some basic information, and that he added with Tsarfati much of the additional textual material that we found in the Ilan. But in this British Library manuscript, we find a commentary on the Spherote that retains those medallions and shows us more or less the same text that we see in Khalfan's Ilan. One of the most extraordinary things, though, about the Khalfan Ilan is something I'd like to show you now, which is that it has this small arboreal figure under the large arboreal figure. This large one is the world of emanation, the highest world of the Godhead. The smaller one is a more of an angelic realm, one level down in the hierarchy of being. And if you look carefully, you can even see that underneath it, it says Mikanu lemata olama galgalim, which means if I had added more parchment sheets and wanted to continue this, we would be going down into the world of the planetary spheres. But he didn't do that. We'll see in a moment an Ilan that did. But the crazy thing is, if you turn this Ilan onto its verso, we see that precisely aligned with that smaller Ilan is an arbor of the demonic side. So, you know, if we could shine a bright light through this parchment, we would see that Khalfan and Tsarfati precisely aligned the side of good and the side of evil on opposite sides of the parchment, truly embodying the Kabbalistic notion of evil as the Sita Akhra, the other side. So if you want to know about the side of holiness, you read the recto. If you want to read about the side of evil, flip it to the verso. Okay. And the last of this part of my talk is an Ilan that's preserved in a later copy. It's an early 17th century copy of a much older Ilan. Again, a wonderful story behind it. But this Ilan, you can see it's the most colorful of the classical Ilanot. I think it's fair to say it's the most colorful Ilan we know. It was copied by James Bonaventure Hepburn, who was employed to decipher a very, very old and difficult to read parchment that had been in the collection of Egidio di Viterbo, and then found its way into Catalina de Medici's library, and then made it to the library in Paris. In other words, a story. The text is a text from the 14th century, which is likely when this Ilan was produced. And this is the Ilan known as the Great Parchment, Hayiri'ah Hagdolah. My friend, Giulio Buzzi, who I mentioned before, published the text of this work, a number of realizing that this Oxford copy from 1605 retained the text that he knew it was from an Ilan, but he didn't think any Ilanot survived that retained the text. So at some point I had a kind of an awakening moment of that when I thought, you know, I got to check to see if there's a connection between what Buzzi published in this book and what's in this beautiful Ilan in Oxford. So I took my photocopy and started marking it up. What you're seeing here are my very amateurish page markings to Giulio's edition, which was obviously sufficient to establish that indeed this 14th century work on the Spherote by Reuven Tzorfati had in fact survived on one Ilan, and that Ilan is this Oxford 49. That's the end of part one. I gotta hustle. Now I'm gonna do part two. Part two is gonna be short, but very exciting. Part two is the magnum opus of Renaissance Ilanot, the magnificent parchment. And this is kind of the Ilan created by the person who thought, okay, I'm putting everything in. I'm going for it in every way. Likely produced for the first time sometime maybe in the late 15th century. It's hard to say with certainty. Copies were being made for something like 200 years thereafter. You'll see in a moment that this was a luxury manuscript that would not have only been of interest to Kabbalists, probably not even primarily of interest to Kabbalists, but also just of interest to collectors who would have thought it worthy of their cabinets of curiosities. I mentioned Catalina De Medici, who seems to have, well, she inherited that Egidio de Viterbo Ilan. A later Medici was also interested in acquiring a copy of the magnificent parchment. About a dozen survive. Let me show you them just for a few minutes. I know it's difficult to see on your screens. They're nearly a meter wide and nearly 3 meters in length. And we'll have a chance to go inside, but basically you're seeing now.
Excuse me, Professor?
Yes.
I'm sorry, the share screen seems to be not working. If you could, stop share and then reshare, I think it should work.
Thank you for bringing that to my attention. Can you see something now?
Absolutely.
Oh, okay. So this is part two. And this is the image of Oxford. The Oxford witness, we say, of the manuscript family that I named Magnificent Parchment. And let's just see a few different ones. This is the Vatican copy. This is the British Library copy, which is the only one that has a colophon that tells us that it was copied by an itinerant Polish Kabbalist named David Darshan while he was in Modena in the middle of the 16th century. This is a very interesting fragment that survives in Leeds, which shows us a work in progress. Somebody started copying the great parchment, but didn't finish. It gives us a little bit of a sense of what it meant to take on the task of copying this fantastic Ilan. I want to give you a little walkthrough also. Well, let's just say for a moment, you saw, maybe not so well yet, but it has a big arboreal figure that takes about 2/3 of the parchment. And then the bottom third is devoted to a zodiac. But in addition to those major icons or major elements in the parchment, it also has a number of minor elements that are scattered around in meaningful locations. And one of the things that we've been looking at, when I say we, I'm not trying to speak in the royal we. I mean, my indispensable collaborators of many years now, Dr. Eliezer Baumgarten and now Dr. Uri Safrai, and for many years, Dr. Menachem Kalus, and recently joining us, Dr. Chana Gentili, and helping us with the paleographical elements in this Ilan, Dr. Emma Abate, who I think is lurking somewhere among you in the Zoom world this evening. What I want to say is we have also found not only the textual sources for Ilanot, but we're also interested in looking at the visual repertoire, the iconographical repertoire that they employed or deployed or appropriated to create these artifacts. So this is quite an unusual schema to present the Spherote as a kind of a wheel with spokes, but this is one of many of the smaller elements that can be found in a work that survives in a number of manuscripts that I call the Booklet of Kabbalistic Forms, a kind of Kabbalistic book of emblems with icons and their interpretation. So this is one of them. It's called Sod Gan Ve'eden, the secret of the garden and Eden. Another one is this, what I call a botanical Ilan. It's rare to find Kabbalists using the arboreal schema and adding leaves to it, making it look more tree-like, which is something we do find in Christian religious appropriations of the arboreal diagram in the Middle Ages. This too is in these manuscripts, as you can see here. This is a wedding canopy array of the Spherote, which is also found in that same book of Kabbalistic emblems. And as is this, a different kind of, this is a representation of the tree of life from the Garden of Eden. So we have textual sources and we have visual sources that are all coming into play in this extraordinary parchment that has about 33,000 words of text. And this, I'll say parenthetically, will be the first critical edition to be published on the platform we are now developing with our partners at the University of Göttingen's Digital Humanities Laboratory. The platform is called Maps of God. And hopefully quite soon you'll be able to do deep dives into this family of manuscripts. You can see one of the interesting iconographical elements here is that Ein Sof, the infinite that's above the tree of the Spherote, is represented by the eye in this diagram. Another story could be told just about the inscription here in that eye, which goes back to Liber de Causus, a Neoplatonic work translated into Hebrew by Judah Romano that was circulating among Renaissance Jewish intellectuals. You have an amazing world here. Ein Sof, the tree of the Spherote, the zodiac, some surprises in the zodiac as well. In addition to showing the planetary spheres, you have the iconographic representation of the signs of the zodiac. Something quite unusual for Jews to see, a representation of rabbis. These are the four who entered the Pardes, the four who entered the orchard, from a famous story from the Talmudic tractate of Chagiga about the dangers, and I suppose you could say the dangers and potential rewards of entering the divine realm. And Rabbi Akiva is the only one of the four who manages to do so successfully. He is here, one of the four. Ben Azai has already had too much, his system overloaded, and he died. He's lying, or he's already down in the first round. And the ascent of these four sages into the divine realm is presented with a text embedded that discusses or treats this issue from a sort of a Kabbalistic Heichalot point of view. You can see there are the 6 heavens and the crown that the successful sage will use, the crown of the divine name, to penetrate into the heavenly realms, until Rabbi Akiva stands among the beasts of the chariot going back to Ezekiel chapter 1, he's now there among them, successfully having ascended to the very top of the cosmos, but not, of course, to the very top of the chain of being that goes up to Ein Sof that we saw at the top of the parchment. Because as we, I suppose, would expect if we're familiar with Ezekiel 1, the chariot beasts are still under the firmament, and the firmament is still under the throne of glory, which is shown here, a kind of Renaissance chaise lounge. And who's sitting on the chariot? Who is sitting on the chariot? I mean, not the, yeah, on the chariot, but on the throne of glory, the figure of God. What is this figure of God? The tree of the Spherote. The tree of Spherote is, you could say, parked, seated on the throne of glory. So that's the end of part 2. I promised it was going to be short and sweet. And I want to give myself maybe 20 minutes now to give you Lurianic Ilanot. By 9:10, I'll stop and take your questions. So, okay, now I have to do a new share. Oh, wait. Okay. So, all right. So we're coming to Lurianic Ilanot. Here's a problem with this field is that
it didn't move.
It didn't work?
No.
Okay. So I'll try again. Seemed like it was working. All right. Share screen. Tell me if this works.
Yes.
You see 2.0, Ilanot 2.0?
Yes.
Okay, great. So ideally, all of you would have come with some familiarity with classical Kabbalah, Lurianic Kabbalah. It's a bit like talking about Euclidean diagrams without knowing if everybody has studied Euclidean geometry. But okay, let's hope for the best. Here we go, Lurianic Ilanot. It doesn't start out as Ilanot because we don't have any reason to think that Isaac Luria himself made diagrams. As my teacher Shlomo Carlebach used to say, only tourists use maps. And Luria wasn't a tourist, he was a local. So he didn't need the maps. Vital already, his most famous and prominent student, already was making some maps. And let's just look quickly, maybe the most famous and ubiquitous of these simple Vitalian Lurianic maps was called Igulim, the Yosher, circles and linear, that after the auto evacuation, the Tzimtzum of the infinite, the Spherote were emanated into the vacuum, and circular Spherote, spherical Spherote were emanated, and then they were penetrated through by a channel of divine light. And that channel, because it came from a window, a small window, by definition, where it came in was the top. It all of a sudden had a top and a bottom and right and left and back and front, and that is called Adam Kadmon. That is the primordial atom of Lurianic Kabbalah. And that's, you can see in a simple codex, this is all they needed to write. There are circles and a channel, that's Adam Kadmon, that's primordial atom. Vital also made more complex diagrams to show the rest of the emanatory scheme that he taught, his cosmogonic scheme, which involved inspired by or based on the Zoharic Idrot, it taught that the divine infinite light could only become part of creation through its graduated attenuation. It had to get dimmer and dimmer in a stable way, and it did so through reconfigurations of the Spherote known as Partsufim, or divine personas. And these personas were configured after the shattering of the primordial Spherote that were the first to be emanated into the vacuum. I'm sure that's crystal clear. But to map this structure in a synoptic diagram was something that Vital clearly thought was important. Pedagogically, and probably also what's the word I'm looking for? Maybe, well, let's just say something like meditatively. The contemplation of this synoptic structure of interlocking divine personas was something that he wanted his readers to be able to see expressed visually. The knowledge had to be visualized. And we know that his most famous work, known as Etz Chaim, the tree of life, or the tree of Chaim, Chaim Vital, opened with a large fold-out diagram, which unfortunately is no longer part of that autograph manuscript, but was described by Kabbalists who were able to see it in the early 17th century. So this is a reduction of diagrams, or these are reductions of diagrams that were almost certainly originally inscribed on oversized fold-out pages as well. You can see if you, it says Tzemach. This is how the student Chaim Vital had a son, Shmuel, who guarded his manuscripts in Damascus in the 17th century, early 17th century. Yaakov Tzemach, a converso physician, was his student and then became the teacher of Meir Poppers, who was responsible for editing the work that most of us are familiar with, that's called Etz Chaim. But Tzemach was very interested in diagrams and also a very conscientious scholar. So you'll see here that he writes, Tziur zeh kach haya metzuyar v'katuv miyad harav, which means this was the way Vital drew the diagram. I've copied Vital's diagram. Whereas next to it, he says, Tzemach tziur zeh tziyarti kfi divrei harav. This is my version of the diagram that I based on his text, but it's not his diagram. That's a typical move by Yaakov Tzemach. This is another diagram, just to show you another diagram. We're quite certain that it was based on Vital's original and copied in his lifetime by a Kabbalist who was his neighbor in Damascus. But this is about as far as Vital seems to have gone. We know that he had the fold out. This is not Vital's manuscript, but it is a Vitalian codex that includes in its front matter a fold out Ilan. And what I think is that Kabbalists who saw Vital's manuscript were inspired by him to follow in his footsteps in that way. And so we see actually both of the pictures on your screens are Vital cosmogonic treatises that open with Ilanot in their front matter, or sometimes in their back matter. And these are wonderful examples of those things. Tzemach is the man who became the greatest Kabbalist of his generation after leaving Portugal at the age of 35. And he describes having made an Ilan with a specific intention of raising the granularity of the presentation of the interlocking divine personas known as the Partsufim. And although we don't have an Ilan that has his name on it that says, I did this, and I can explain to you why I think we don't have that, but let's see what we do have. If we look at the very earliest Lurianic Ilanot, one of them at least fits his description very nicely and seems to be the earliest, and I think it's likely that Tzemach was responsible for designing it. So now in the relatively short time that I have, I'm just gonna give you a sense of what's out there in the realm of Lurianic Ilanot. And I basically divide Lurianic Ilanot into single origin Ilanot and compound Ilanot. Single origin Ilanot are the Ilanot that were crafted in the early to mid 17th century. And compound Ilanot are Ilanot that were made Lego style, putting together Ilanot that were originally single origin, and then often supplementing them with novel materials. So just to give you a sense of what's out there, an impression. These are Ilanot that I believe reflect Tzemach's innovation. These are Ilanot 2.0, taking the arboreal schema and redeploying it to show how the divine personas link up together to attenuate gradually the flow of light from Ein Sof and Adam Kadmon through the world of Atzilut, the world of emanation. And you can see that he takes great care to show the interlocking connections between these kind of these transpositions between the lower levels of higher personae, and the higher levels of lower personae. And what you're seeing, this is a Munich manuscript. I think I saw Max among you. So he'll know this one very well. On your right of your screen is a Benayahu manuscript that has exactly the same content. And Knorr von Rosenroth, Christian Knorr von Rosenroth, whose Kabbalah Denudata, published in Sulzbach in 1677, with an apparatus containing engravings of all of the Lurianic Ilanot he was able to find, includes this precise Ilan. And that's a whole nother lecture. Tzemach's student seems to have, Meir, whose name is Meir Poppers, the man responsible for Etz Chaim, was inspired by his teacher and went one better. He created an Ilan around 1650 for his students in Krakow, in which he too tried to present with even more detail the process of emanation and the transpositions of the Partsufim, the divine personae. He also added a representation of the head of Adam Kadmon. One of the things that the Ari, that Luria taught, was that the beginning of creation was the flow of lights from the different orifices of the face of Adam Kadmon. So this was also, in his opinion, very important to represent. So this is, Poppers created an Ilan that showed both Adam Kadmon and the Partsufim to a much higher resolution than did his teacher Tzemach, excuse me. I know this doesn't look very anthropomorphic, but we'll see. Those of you who can read Hebrew can see Ein Yamin de Adam Kadmon, Nikudim, Ein small, right eye, left eye, mouth, beard, and so forth. But Kabbalists weren't afraid to make this a little bit more anthropomorphic, as we'll see in a moment. It goes all the way down to Jerusalem. We can just put that on the side. This is from Ein Sof to Jerusalem, at least Jerusalem on high. This also is another single origin Ilan that focuses on the different manifestations of the Tetragrammaton and its expanded forms in the various divine personae. And now I'm really moved. Now, 2 minutes on compound Ilanot. Here we see Kabbalists are starting to have a lot of fun with their cosmological Legos pretty early on, still in the 17th century. And they're putting them together in all kinds of interesting ways. Well, this is not the one I was going to show you first, but this is somebody who tried to go deep on the circles and linear emanation to see if he could get them to all fit together perfectly at a much higher degree of detail. But he's borrowed freely from the Tzemach and Popper's Ilanot to do so. Here we have two relatively early compound Ilanot that put Tzemach and Poppers together. Just Tzemach and Poppers. They do so in two different ways. These are really the two main compound Lurianic Ilanot in their most essential form without any additional materials. The one on the right is in the library of 770 in Crown Heights, New York. It's the Chabad Ilan, which you can see is a beautiful Ilan with very graceful drawings and deer and towers and architectural elements and so forth, birds. The face of Adam Kadmon, you can see, is getting more anthropomorphic. The ears look quite a bit like ears, as does the nose and the eyes and so forth. But I guess the Cambridge Trinity scroll goes one better. Here you can see Ein Sof is inscribed on the crown atop the head of the primordial Adam, and the eyes and the nostrils and the ears and the mouth don't make you, you don't have to guess what they represent. Actually, I wish I had a bit more time, but this is characteristically Popper's language, the way he describes the attributes of the mind of Adam Kadmon, and speaks about memory and thought and contemplation and so forth, a kind of surprising, almost psychologized cosmogony. Now, if I go out just a bit, you'll see that in the Cambridge Trinity scroll, you have Adam Kadmon and Arich Anpin, the highest persona, and then Arich Anpin and the other Partsufim are given as they are found in the Tzemach Ilan, and then he goes back to Poppers, and he goes all the way down to Jerusalem. Whereas in the Chabad, he keeps it completely separate. It's as if he took the Poppers, put Poppers first. It's later, but it has Adam Kadmon, so it begins higher. So you would want to begin there, and you're seeing now all of Poppers, and then all of Tzemach. I think I did a little animated version of this. So you can sort of see, here's Jerusalem at the bottom of Poppers on your right, and And on the left, you're at the bottom of poppers. On the right, you're at the bottom of tzemach, on these two very early compound ilanot. This I just threw in at the last minute so that you could see that that ilan of divine names that I just momentarily showed you before, one of the single origin ilanot, also ends up in compound scrolls as this beautiful exemplar in the unrivaled collection of William Gross. By the way, quite a bit of what we'll see, especially in this Lurianic section, is from William Gross's collection, which is also the really the heart of my forthcoming book on Ilanot. Here you will see Tzemach in this same Ilan, and at the bottom, yet another diagrammatic element that found its way into Ilanot that diagrams the 13 qualities of mercy, which are also very important for Kabbalistic meditation and based on the Zoharic Idrot. A few words just on, I call it transformations. Well, maybe I was trying to be a bit too ambitious, but if most people who've seen a single Kabbalistic Ilan have seen something related to the Warsaw either the 1864 printed edition or the 1894 second edition, also published in Warsaw. And these are printed mechanical reproductions of a mid-19th century compound Lurianic Ilan that begins with an Ilan that actually was crafted originally by Christian Knorr von Rosenroth. So this is a one wonderful story is how a Christian Kabbalist's diagrams made it into the most famous of all Jewish Ilanot. You're getting a glimpse of that, of what I could use to explain that to you had we more time. These upper frames are based on Knorr's diagrams that were inspired by his reading in the 1648 Emek Hamelech, the Valley of the King by Naftali Bachrach, which is a representation of the Kabbalah of Israel Saruk, for those of you who appreciate these details. After getting through this kind of a prequel, or I don't know what you're supposed to call these things, the story before Adam Kadmon, you get two poppers, Adam Kadmon. And that's here. And here I simply wanted to show you what the poppers Adam Kadmon looked like in the manuscript that served as the model for the mechanical reproduction of 1864. This is how it looks in print on the paper scroll, printed in Warsaw, 1864. And then in 1893, it was republished, but by editors who felt that the anthropomorphism was too much and inappropriate for public distribution. And what you're seeing is the boulderized version of exactly this image. In other words, the head of Adam Kadmon that you're seeing in the 1864 printing now looks like this in the 1893 edition. It's no longer printed on a paper scroll either. It's now printed on pages of a regular book. It's a story in itself. And my very, 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 very last words will be on an even later development, which comes only at the end of the 19th century, and that is making Ilanot into amulets. Now, it's fascinating to think about the magical qualities of these parchments going back to the 14th century, or the way they were imagined to work as talismans, what their performance was all about. Much of that, of course, we have to speculate with regard to, because they didn't give us so many directions for use. But what we do know is that only in the late 19th century are people copying these things to wear in silver cases as amulets, and as opposed to a talisman which draws down and makes present the divine, in whose image the talisman is drawn. The amulet is meant to keep bad stuff from happening. So this is I think a very qualitatively different deployment of the Ilan. And one of the characteristic things that you see in the Ilan amulet is that extraneous material is often removed. The diagrams become more important. The texts become, of course, somewhat less important. No one's going to read them anyway. You're wearing it after all. You're not studying it. So here, taken on William Gross's dining room table, the original Copio Kabbalists Ilan, next to a somewhat streamlined version, now with a dedication, an explanation for its uses, and an even smaller miniaturized version to the far right. What you see next to it is very similar, in fact, to the Cambridge Trinity Scroll in terms of when you ask yourself what kind of Ilan was used to as the basis for the amulet. The most common Ilan amulet was based on that compound of tzemach and poppers, where you got Adam Kadmon and Ari Chanpin from poppers, and then you got tzemachs, Ari Chanpin and the partsufim, and then the rest of poppers till Jerusalem again at the bottom, except that in this case, at the very bottom, you get this Ilan, holy Ilan, is capable of everything. If you just wear it, it'll save you. It's great for pregnancies, difficulties in childbirth. It keeps the demons away. It keeps the plagues away. God help us. That's what it says here, L'magefa bar minan. God help us, keeps the plagues away. I think, William, you might be able to sell some of these at a good price nowadays. Kol davar ra, every bad thing, you just need to put it, tzarich lahanicho b'tik kesef mezukak v'yitle alav, just put it in a silver case and wear it, and you'll be all set. So that is the Ilan amulet, and I thank you very much. And I'm happy to take your questions.
Thank you very much, Professor. First of all, I must say there were shout outs from so many places on earth in this event that it was just beautiful to see, and we're very proud and excited at the library. Just to mention a few, there's Florida, Sweden, New York, Arizona, Ireland, Italy, like 5 places, Chicago, Florida, Ukraine, Denver, Colorado, Berlin, and it goes on, and there's so many thanks and appreciations for this talk, and thank you. So I'm going to try to pick a few of the questions out of the many, many that were here in the chat. So I'll go all the way back. Eva asked, what happened to the great parchment once it got to Paris?
We don't know what happened to the illegible copy that was assigned to James Bonaventure Hepburn to copy. It was in such a decrepit state 400 years ago that it seems unlikely to survive. And unfortunately, that makes it all the more difficult to know to what extent at least its iconographical elements were embellished by Hepburn as he copied. it's something something I've talked written a little bit about this, but we simply have no way of knowing. I think that it's safe to say that he added a bit of his artistic skills to beautifying the Elan as he transferred it from its original decaying parchment to its glorious new one.
Thank you very much. David asked 2 questions. Is there a tree of life that includes the 3 heads of Keter? And also, why circles? Did anyone ever diagram the Spherote in any other geometric form?
If the reference is to the so-called the 3 heads that are in Kabbalat Ari, the Tlat Rashin, then indeed the family of Ilanot made by the Baghdadi Kabbalist by the name Shanduch feature precisely those 3 heads. And my good friend and colleague Eliezer Baumgarten is publishing an article on those 3 heads in the next issue of Images. So all of you 3 heads fans will be able to learn more about them very soon. And I did at least quickly give some examples of other arrays of the Spherote in the magnificent parchment: the wedding canopy array, the spoked wheel array, and I also very briefly in the first section showed the beginning of the 6th gate of Cordovero's Pardes Rimonim, Orchard of Pomegranates, in which he makes a kind of inventory of the different schema that have been suggested by Kabbalists for representing the structure of the Spherote. What is especially interesting to me is that despite his philosophical inclinations, which made him loath to ascribe a spatial dimension to the Spherote as divine entities beyond space, he would try and say that we represent them spatially, but they actually, our spatial representations are conversions of what are actually causal relationships between the Spherote. Nevertheless, he distinguished between symbolic, iconographic representations of the Spherote and structural, real representations, maps of the spherotic array. So the very first spherotic diagram that he presents in that chapter is one in which the Spherote are arrayed in the shape of the first Hebrew letter Aleph, about which he says, this is a very nice diagram and it teaches us some very important lessons about divine unity, but that's not how the Godhead is structured. This is symbolic, but it's not a map. And he wants to establish the correct map, and which ultimately leads him to that arboreal form, which is, again, despite the philosophical reluctance to overly ontologize that schema, that basically that's where we end up.
Thank you very much. Jane asked, is it possible that creating the Ilanot was in itself a meditative practice?
Absolutely. Absolutely. One thing is clear about these artifacts, and that is that they could be made by beginners. But they could also be made by the greatest Kabbalists of the age, and you know, my teacher Mary Carruthers. I've actually 2 teachers who both taught me the same thing: Shlomo Carlebach and Mary Carruthers. Probably the first time they've ever been mentioned in one sentence together. Both taught me that the answer is always both, or at least that it's never just one thing. So contemplation, pedagogy, mnemonics, the generative thinking with capacity of the diagrams could all be brought into play. One of the texts that my research group is working on now is a very intriguing 20-page manual for drawing an ilan using very precise measurements and technical terminology, but it's presented in at least two of the earliest manuscripts as the culminating chapter of an introductory course of Kabbalah, as the kind of graduation performance. And the introduction to Kabbalah ends by saying, if you really want to do Kabbalah, you have to not only see it in your mind's eye, but you have to commit it to writing. You must create an ilan. This is part of the practice. And they don't phrase it as part of the practice. It's the culminating practice of this Kabbalistic education.
Thank you very much. Papa wrote a very interesting question. He wrote, I'm curious as to, are these emanations also used or depicted in the other two Abrahamic faiths? And is this philosophy mainly inherent in Judaism? I heard that the Kabbalah is the esoteric side that Moshe received, so I wonder if the other faiths also kept it.
Kabbalah is a form of Jewish esotericism that emerged in the Middle Ages, in the 12th century, undoubtedly with some roots that go back further, but the specific notions of the Spherote and the way they're understood in what we call Kabbalah, referring to a corpus that begins in the 12th century and continues thereafter for hundreds of years. We have no evidence of earlier understandings of the Spherote in the same sense. That said, it was very popular in the Middle Ages and in the early modern period to presume that this was a perennial wisdom and Prisca Theologia, the most ancient wisdom and theology that predated all of the canonical scriptures. Many Christians from the earliest period of Kabbalah took interest in Kabbalah, presuming it to be ancient, and for many hundreds of years presuming that the truth of Christianity could be demonstrated on the basis of Kabbalistic principles. So Christians were very interested in Kabbalah. Only in the 17th century, and especially with Knorr, whom I mentioned a few times this evening, do we see what I consider to be a non-tendentious Christian interest in Kabbalah. It's not really about converting the Jews or about proving Christianity, but a genuine interest in Kabbalah. And it's shared by a number of leading intellectuals in the 17th century, including Henry Moore of the Cambridge Platonists and Isaac Newton, who was a well-known physicist at the time. The situation in Islam is different. They have interesting diagrammatic treatises. My friend and colleague Tzvi Langerman has written a bit on some interesting Islamic parallels, but there isn't really a phenomenon of Islamic Kabbalah that I could speak of in the same way that I could about Christian Kabbalah and Christian interest in the tree of life and the Spherote in particular. I couldn't get into it tonight, but it seems clear to me that in the 16th century, Christians were no less interested in the tree of life than were Jews. And as I said at the very beginning of my talk, it's Guillaume Postel who lists Ilanot as one of the main genres of Jewish creativity. So Christians are certainly very interested, and Max is here, who's finishing his PhD in Munich and working on the Syriac edition of the New Testament, and that was published by Wittmanstätter, which includes a tree of the Spherote that's mapped to Jesus on the crucifix. And so the tree of life and the tree of which the crucifix was hewn are associated by Christians, and the triangulation of the Kabbalistic tree always seemed to Christian eyes, to be a kind of prefiguration of the Trinity as well. So there is lots to say on the Jewish-Christian front as far as this material is concerned.
Thank you very much. I've got to say more places have been added to our shout out list, like London and other places in California. I'm going to send you the chat list so you can see everyone who said hi and thank you. I have put in the chat room a link for our Hebrew speakers to answer a short survey about our content. And I'm now...
We lost you. Doron. You muted yourself, Doron.
I'm sorry. I just put the link to our website in the chat room so that everyone can see our past events, including this one, which will hopefully be online within 2 to 3 days. I'm going to let everyone open their microphones, please, not all at once, so that you can hear the professor yourself. And hope to see you soon at more events, and have a good night.
Thank you so much. Thank you. Hi, Gila. Nice to see you again. I'm so happy to see you.
And have you met Talia?
I don't think so. Shalom, Talia. What a nice surprise to see you. Okay. Nice.
Hi, Bill. How are you, Bill?
Hi, is there. Wow.
Yossi.
Old home week. Or old men week, one of the two.
I used to see Chaim at the UCA Hillel in 1984.
That's correct. That's correct. You remember well. Wow.
I remember those days very well.
Hey.
William Gross is here. You should get a special shout out. He's the father of the Ilanot project. William began collecting Ilanot 40 years ago and was a nudnik to every Kabbalah scholar to find out what he could know about these artifacts, until someone said, look, you're gonna have to find someone to do the research, because no one's done anything on this. And he did. He kept knocking on doors.
And there you were.
We have to write a pop song about that.
Yeah.
And we have Emma, Bate, Rome. Hi, Emma.
Hi, Emma.
So Emma, William says hi, Emma.
Hello.
And Boaz is here. Sarah. Oh. And our youngest participant, Eliezer Baumgarten. Eliezer is like in the Hasidic story where the Rebbe switches place with the Balagula. I'm the Balagula who's out front now, and the Rebbe is here watching from the sidelines. If you have any real questions, you can send them to Eliezer. He's the one who knows all the manuscripts up and down, inside and out.
Shout out to Santiago de Chile.
Sarah, I want you to know I keep track of you through my granddaughter.
Wow.
Thanks.
And I see.
Sarah is my granddaughter's favorite professor. So.
Oh. And Giulio Buzzi is here on the screen, at least in name, a muted name. And Julie Chayes, unbelievable. Hi, Giulio. Ciao, Giulio. Wow, I hope you were here in the beginning when I showed the covers of your book and sang your praises. And Jesus. And Safira.
Hey, thank you, Yossi.
There's the Kef and Sis from Amsterdam. So nice. Hirsch. Wow, and Esti Lassman from Penn. Uri Safrai, another right-hand man. Unbelievable.
See you later, Jeff.
So grateful to you, you all for joining me, and I hope it wasn't too much of a breathless experience. I decided to go broad rather than deep because
זה היה מדהים, יוסי, ממש, ממש מרתק.
good. All right. At
זה
least
לא
now
פעם ראשונה שאני...
you got like the big picture. The big picture. Now, of course, on every single artifact that you saw tonight has a story to tell, and that is, and of course, no single book will ever tell all of those stories. But I'm making my best attempt to tell a lot of them in this book that Littman will publish next year. And it's the kind of book that you feel a little bit bad seeing it come out in the first edition. It's a book that should come out for the first time in the second edition, but we'll have to be patient. Give it a few years. I'm absolutely certain that the day after it goes to press, we'll have a major new discovery that will just
We hope so.
change everything. We do. It's just they don't stop coming. Thank goodness. Hi, Karen. Wow. Kef. All right. Well.
Okay, thank you very much, everybody. Have a beautiful night and come back and see us on our website. Laila Tov.
Wonderful.
Laila
Ciao.
Tov.
Laila Tov.
Bye. Thank
you,
you.
Yossi.
Laila Tov.
Feel good. Get an Ilan amulet.